Alrighty. Howdy. So, as you all probably realized or noticed, I didn't put up a quiz for this chapter. I'm still thinking about it, but if I do, you'll get more time on it, like always. Because as I was reading through this chapter, this is kind of, I guess, I thought it was a good way of summarizing what we've been talking about so far. So why don't we just go through it, kind of like last time, read and talk about it, and we can like go from there, right? Did anyone have any before we get started on that? Did anyone have any like questions or other housekeeping stuff? Okay, cool. Remember to try to get the pack thing done. And I know that I didn't put it in the assignment, but we do need to respond to each other too. So make sure you get that done. So we're on 68, section 9, the social and the private. Alrighty. What we called earlier the rise of the social coincided historically with the transformation of the private care for private property into a public concern. So, remember the section was literally, I think, called The Rise of the Social? What section was that? 6, I think, right? Yeah, 6. So what may start happening, what did you all think of this section, just having read it? It was shorter than the last couple of sections we read, right? Which was probably a nice break, but any thoughts or reactions to it? What I was going to say was that you may at a certain point begin to notice, or it may begin to sound like you've heard a lot of this before, or that she's repeating herself a lot. So that's not just you, that really is happening. But because that's happening, a lot of what she says is going to draw on what she has said before in the book, and a lot of it's just going to be like repeated a lot and a lot, right? So if you're noticing that it really is happening, and that's a good opportunity for you if you didn't get something the first time to see how she's representing it again and again, so that maybe it'll stick, right? So if you weren't sure what the rise of society was before, then at least in this first sentence, like a lot of her sentences, which are really long and dense, she's sort of reminding you, oh, the rise of the social was when private property became a public concern, which it hadn't been before. Society, when it first entered the public realm, assumed the disguise of an organization of property owners, who instead of claiming access to the public realm because of their wealth, demanded protection from it for the accumulation of more wealth. In the words of Bodon, government belonged to the kings and property to subjects, so that it was the duty of the kings to rule in the interest of their subjects' property. The commonwealth, as has recently been pointed out, largely existed for the common wealth, right? So remember that last time we talked about what makes up the city and the public, including the fact that we can appear in the public and the fact that there's this common world of objects that we've engineered and created all around us. And so the public is sort of like the external, like front-facing view of that city, with the houses and the buildings and the walls and the exteriors, right? And the inside houses private life, where birth and death and life and eating and all of those things happen. And the important thing there was that what makes the distinction between private and public is the relative sanctity of the boundaries between them, not what goes on inside one or the other, right? But with the rise of society, as she's saying, it's not just the boundaries that became important. In society, in the rise of society, people began to be focused on what goes on in private, or like sort of the household life. And one of the things which we're going to see again iterated in this chapter or in this section is that one of the activities that used to be regarded as one of the private activities was accumulating wealth, right? It wasn't considered a publicly important thing because what was important for entering the public was primarily that you had property. It's only whenever wealth sort of becomes an additional need because you have to sustain yourself. You can't just have a house and nothing else, right? We have to have a way of making. We have to have a way of making a living, but that way of making a living, whatever it was, used to be considered private. Once your property becomes your wealth, then though wealth enters the public sphere in the sense that now it becomes like property, something you have to protect, right? So in this chapter, what we're building up to, or what's kind of happening in the background is the rise of, leaving feudal society up through like the early national period, like the development of nation states, to the framework we now have, which is a largely capitalist system, right? In which the job of the government becomes protecting the interests that we as private citizens have in trying to use in the past acquire property, but now protecting our interest in the terms of protecting our wealth, right? So that's what all that means. Does that make sense to you so far? Okay. When this commonwealth, the result of activities formerly banished to the privacy of the households, was permitted to take over the public realm, private possessions, which are essentially much less permanent and much more vulnerable to the mortality of their owners than the common world, which always grows out of the past and is intended to last for future generations, began to undermine the durability of the world. It is true that wealth can be accumulated to a point where no individual lifespan can use it up, so that the family, rather than the individual, becomes its owner. Yet wealth remains something to be used and consumed, no matter how many individual lifespans it may sustain. Only when wealth became capital, whose chief function was to generate more capital, did private property equal or come close to the permanence inherent in the commonly shared world. I'll just finish the paragraph and then we can talk about it. However, this permanence is of a different nature. It is the permanence of a process rather than the permanence of a stable structure. Without the process of accumulation, wealth would at once fall back into the opposite process of disintegration through use and consumption. So, what do you all make of that paragraph? What is she saying about wealth? How does wealth compare to stuff? Or not just any stuff, but like buildings, for instance.
It's not permanent.
Okay, so it's not permanent. Okay, is it, relatively speaking, right? How might it become more permanent? Well, if you have a lot of it, you don't run out, right? You could be as rich as Elon Musk, and that seems pretty permanent, right? Except, I mean, of course, then again, you could also be like Mark Zuckerberg, and that might and lose $230 billion in a day. Like that also, in that sense, it is still impermanent, right? But this thing she says, right, this permanence is of a different nature because, of course, what she seems to be getting at is that we've moved or transitioned into a paradigm or a system of thinking in which, because we confuse property and wealth, we now, and remember we talked about this last time too, the idea that you can have really wealthy societies that nevertheless are propertyless, right? That's a thing that you can have. So in tracing this, how we sort of switched or traded wealth for property, like a lot of things that she's going to point out, is sort of like that we can do that, but it has sort of certain consequences, including the fact that unlike the original sense of private property, which is a piece of world you have to yourself, land, a house, a property, wealth is not permanent in the same way. What kind of permanence does it have?
So it's the permanence of the process.
Yeah. Any idea what that means or what that could mean?
The ability to increase your wealth, like the process of increasing your wealth.
That's definitely part of that process, right? The accumulation is part of that process, definitely. So if money, so yeah, that's the thing, right? If we ever ask ourselves, what is money? It's a little bit of a weird question, right? Because on one hand, if anybody carries cash anymore, you could produce dollar bills and coins and all of that. But the value of money, as you may know, or maybe not, I don't know. I still don't understand money. I'm not an economist. But the thing about money is that its value actually fluctuates, right? Um, that's part of the whole process of inflation, right? The fact that although you're still holding the material thing like the dollar or the coin, it doesn't get its value from the metal it's made out of, which is not that precious, or the cotton paper that it's made out of, because that's not that important, right? So the value of hoarding money, if you hoard money, is not the value of having intrinsically valuable stuff. It's having the value of something that you can exchange, right? Because the thing that remains constant is not the actual value of money, which is indexed to a whole complicated system that we call the economy. It is the fact that you can trade it for stuff, right? And so that is a kind of permanence, but it's the permanence of a process, because if ever you stop exchanging it, then it loses value, right? It's, this is how we have the difficulty of, people during recessions don't want to spend because they're all sort of hoarding the money because of fears about the future. But then that means the economy becomes weaker, all that sort of stuff, which you may hear in the news or which you may know something about, right? But the point about going from property to wealth is going from the permanence of like a stable place with four walls to something that is permanent, a never-ending market exchange, right? So that is what it means to say that this permanence is of a different nature. It's the permanent process rather than the permanence of a stable structure. And because without accumulation, which you always have to be doing, buying and selling, exchange, and all that, well, we at once fall back into the opposite process of disintegration through use and consumption. So also pay attention to what she said earlier in that paragraph where yet wealth remains something to be used and consumed, no matter how many individual lifespans it may sustain. So again, like when she's talking about, we could talk about the wealth of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, right? Where it's true that you can have so much money that you don't run out in your lifetime. And in that sense, it can also be permanent because you might, win the lottery and then you'll be set for life, right? But the question is, what happens after you die, right? One of the things about property was that it was so closely associated with the families who had it that they were like the same thing, right? And now, though, the value that you have and that the wealth that you can retain and sort of build on, even though you can build it to where you become like the Rockefellers or like the Rothschilds or whatever, then the money is still itself only has value in terms of its exchange value, right? So we move from what we might call intrinsic value, if not that, we can talk about intrinsic value at some point, but we move from intrinsic value, something that's supposed to have value for its own sake or existence, to an exchange value, the value we can get from trading it with other people. And also notice how that kind of does mirror the reason why she associates this with the rise of the society or the rise of the social is because what she's kind of drawing our attention to is that our conception of value, which was at one point, or of course historically, tightly indexed to real possessions or things, particularly, of course, the original one being property. That process, which used to be very tangible and in front of us, so to speak, is now kind of invisible and everywhere. Like, do any of you have a proclivity to shop online and wind up just spending it's so dangerous for me to log into Amazon because I wind up with 3 things I didn't need, especially if there was a good deal, right? So there's a sense in which this whole economy thing, which follows from society becoming a whole conglomeration of housekeeping endeavors, you go from that, because of that, it mirrors it in the sense that now if you ask where does like the real value of money come from, it's kind of really difficult to explain, right? It's pretty abstract. And so in mirror society, in that now, again, even though we are together and we need to be together, if you try to locate society, it's a little difficult. Like you can, of course, you can just be like all of this, but what is all of this, right? In as much as society blurs the line between private and public, it also means that it's harder to identify where society really is. It's also why it's very easy to fall into like delusional and conspiratorial thinking about us versus them. Because if you think in terms of us versus them, or you're trying to think on the level of certain groups, it can be very difficult to locate and point to where those groups are. You can feel like there's just this big oppressive cloud of others around you, for instance, like social media, without necessarily ever interacting physically with them, right? So that's a parallel between the rise of society and between the transfer from thinking primarily of value in terms of property or objects to a fluid market that just depends on exchange value, right? Are we good so far? Okay. So commonwealth, therefore, this is on 69, can never become common in the sense we speak of a common world. It remained, or rather was intended to remain, strictly private. Only the government, appointed to shield the private owners from each other in the competitive struggle for more wealth, was common. The obvious contradiction in this modern conception of government, where the only thing people have in common is their private interests, need no longer bother us as it still bothered Marx, since we know that the contradiction between private and public, typical of the initial stages of the modern age, has been a temporary phenomenon which introduced the utter extinction of the very difference between the private and public realms, the submersion of both in the sphere of the social. Okay? So all that should sound like she's repeating herself, like sort of because of the rise of society, we lose the distinction between private and public, right? By the same token, we are in a far better position to realize the consequences of human existence when both the public and private spheres of life are gone. The public, because it has become a function of the private, and the private, because it has become the only common concern left. What do y'all think it means to say that the only thing people have in common is their private interests? Or we could do the first sentence too, which is like, commonwealth can never become common in the way we speak of the common world. What do y'all think she means by that?
Trying to say it's not something that can be shared.
Yeah, that seems to be it. That seems to be it, yeah. If it can't be common to us, it's not something that we can really share, for sure. So maybe we'll be ready to do it this way. What made the common world the common world? Because we talked about it, I guess, last time on Monday, right? It's all has to do with what she means by worldliness and artifice and all that. But what made the common world the common world? Either made it common or made it a world.
Things and people.
Yeah, okay, so the things and people, for one, that's what the world consists in. And what kind of things particularly? We talked about the difference between things being necessary or useful, and I think we did all that, right? And what's the process called when we eat up the things that we need? Yeah. What is it called when you, what is the process that this stuff is involved? I would say it, but then it would make it really, really obvious. Use. Of course, that is why the words kind of are the way they are, right? Like sort of like it's useful. So the process involved in literally consuming necessary things is consumption. And use is the process we engage with these kinds of objects. So again, what's the difference between, all right, so consumption, what are the things that we consume called? Yeah, it's really consumptibles. And what are these things? Yeah. So, and what's the difference between consumptibles and use objects? The biggest one, I guess. What's the difference between a plastic fork that you throw away and a silver one that you don't? Right? Yeah, relative permanence. So use objects are supposed to have the most relative permanence. Why? Because you want to be able to use them for a long time, right? You don't want, a house that is only going to last for 10 years. Ideally, you want a house that's going to last longer than that, right? Now, and of course, no house is going to last forever, but you certainly don't want to test the fate by doing a bad job, right? And consumptibles, how long do they last? Or how long are they supposed to last? Yeah, until you've consumed it, right? There's no such thing as, there's no such thing as Control Z on eating a cheeseburger, right? It is Control Z, right? Like the command for undoing something. Point is, you consume them and then it's done. That's what it means to consume them. So what might it mean in economic terms to suggest that we are consumers? Because we are, right? That's what we're called. That's what business people talk about us as whenever they're planning how to get us to go for the deal on Amazon, right? We're consumers. So what does that mean about us? Surely at the very least that we consume stuff, right? But of course, that means that if we think of ourselves primarily as consumers, right? Because again, that's kind of like what she was talking about, where we're like, if you're only thinking about us in terms of the fact that we labor, but you don't really need other people for that, you could just be considered an animal of morons. Or at the same time, although we are laboring animals, you could call us homo faber, right, the fabricator. And those are ways of thinking about us in terms of like, what really primarily are we as people, right? And then naturally, the climax or the epitome of this would be naturally the citizen, right? The politician, the speaker, the one who is able to engage in the free life of the common world. But if you think of us primarily as consumers, where does that seem to place us within the hierarchy, or it's not supposed to be hierarchy, right? But within the trifecta of labor, work, and action, if we're primarily consumers. Well, let's just do it this way, right? We're not worried about action right now. We're not talking about it. But which of these processes corresponds to laboriousness, to labor?
Necessities, like the consumption part?
Yeah, consumption is the thing we do and that we have to deal with because of labor, because of the fact that the processes are always going to mirror each other, right? The reason why consumption mirrors the process of labor is because labor is the process of metabolizing things you consume to keep you alive, right? Which one of the three does use correspond to primarily?
Work.
Yeah. We work because we want finished products that are going to be more enduring and more durable, last longer than the stuff that we have to eat, right? Or the other stuff, right? Like our toilet paper and diapers and all of that stuff, which is really a one-use kind of thing, right? And again, we have not talked about action, but if the process of consumption links up with the process of consumption, and we think of ourselves primarily as consumers, what does that mean we also primarily think of ourselves as? Yeah. And one of Arendt's points is that in the modern world as we find it, most of us take for granted that our primary function is as laborers, right? Have you ever sort of wondered why it was necessary for you to come to college at all? Why did we come to college at all? Anyone really? I don't know your lives.
Credentials.
Credentials, what like so a degree.
Have a degree.
Okay, and why did that's one. Let's keep that. Anyone else? So the seeking of credentials, qualifications, the degree. Did anyone else come for a different reason? Okay, so presumably you're here for a degree. Why do you need a degree? Or why do you want a degree? Okay, to get a good job. Why do you need a good job? Or what do you mean by a good job? Like, we could have really two separate questions, first of all. What do we mean by a good job? Two, why do we need a job?
Make a living.
Yeah, to make a living. Isn't it odd that the point of all of this thing of coming to college and spending God knows how much money and meeting people and forming relationships was in the end also that you could make a living? I mean, I'm not knocking y'all, but that seems kind of stupid. It sounds like I grew up to survive, right? So not only are we laborers and consumers, we're all also primarily survivors. Of what? This stupid, pointless life process. Not that life is stupid, but that if you really think about it, isn't it odd that with all the alleged and supposed freedoms we have, the number one thing on all of our minds is how we're going to survive? Like we're bleedy cave people. Supposedly, the rise of civilization was supposed to mean that we weren't just surviving cave people, right? Something like 10,000 years ago. Otherwise, why did we bother inventing agriculture? Point being, like, was the thing that one of the things we take for granted, one of our givens, which Arendt is like, that's kind of weird if you look at history, is that we primarily think of ourselves in terms of the job we're going to get. And even though it would be nice to have a high-paying job so that you can do some cool, frivolous social stuff, like have parties and go traveling and, all of that kind of stuff, in the end of the day, the thing that all our minds are consumed by is the fact that we're consumers. And when social scientists and economists and people like think about the people, this is the esteem they have for us, right? There's not even a need to discuss ambition to immortality. What are the consumers going to want to consume next? What can we make them want to consume next? What can we feed them through commercials and social media until it consumes their mind as much as the fact that they need to survive? Just saying, I don't know, that I'm not being negative or trying to be particularly negative. It's just like, that is where this is all kind of is going, if we think of ourselves primarily as consumers, right? Seen from this viewpoint, still on 69, the modern discovery of intimacy seems a flight from the whole outer world into the inner subjectivity of the individual, which formerly had been sheltered and protected by the private realm. The disillusion of this realm into the social may most conveniently be watched in the progressing transformation of immobile and mobile property until eventually the distinction between property and wealth between the fungibilis and consumptibilis of Roman law loses all significance because every tangible, fungible thing has become an object of consumption. It lost its private use value, which was determined by its location, and acquired an exclusively social value determined through its ever-changing exchangeability, whose fluctuation could itself be fixed only temporarily by relating it to the common denominator of money. So that should also sound like a repeat, but did everyone get that, or do we need to talk about it a bit more? We good? Or okay. Closely connected with this social evaporation of the tangible. Sometimes she just really says cool sounding things, even though you know what they mean, right? The social evaporation of the tangible was the most revolutionary modern contribution to the concept of property, according to which property was not fixed and firmly located part of the world, according to which property was not a fixed and firmly located part of the world, acquired by its owner in one way or another, but on the contrary had its source in man himself, in his possession of a body and his indisputable ownership of the strength of this body, which Marx called labor power. So what kind of power do you all have insofar as you can do jobs or labor? You have labor power. I bet you didn't know you had that. It's not exactly like a superpower, but you do have labor power. It's what makes you exchangeable in this whole consumer market, right? Thus, modern property lost its worldly character and was located in the person himself. That is, in what an individual could lose only along with his life. Historically, Locke's assumption that the labor of one's body is the origin of property is more than doubtful. But in view of the fact that we already live under conditions where our only reliable property is our skill and our labor power, it is more than likely that it will become true. For wealth, after it became a public concern, has grown to such proportions that it is almost unmanageable by private ownership. It is as though the public realm had taken its revenge against those who tried to use it for their private interests. The greatest threat here, however, is not the abolition of private ownership of wealth, but the abolition of private property in the sense of a tangible worldly place of one's own. What do you guys make of that? So one of the things she's talking about, this may come up, actually I have no idea what will come up in your future college careers, I don't know what you're studying, but this could be nevertheless interesting or important. One interesting thing to ask is what it means to own something and why we can own it, right? It's actually like really funny because you don't always say mine the same way in different languages, right? So for instance, for example, in Russian, you say it's mine, right? By saying, my spelling's really bad. Yes, right? Umenia jest. You don't have to know that, obviously. What's funny about this, it's actually really funny. I've gotten great mileages of jokes out of this, is that what this literally means is that it's near me. Isn't that a hilarious way of conceiving of ownership, right? The joke being, of course, for instance, this is precisely what happened with Crimea. Oh, sorry. So several years ago, Russia annexed illegally a part of Ukraine on historical grounds, and they still get a lot of flack for it. But the joke is, it makes perfect sense that an ex-Soviet nation would have this linguistic mentality of like, why did you steal Crimea, Russia? Because it was close to me. Only funny if you keep up with politics, sorry. But kind of that was. What does it mean to say that it's mine? And so John Locke, one of the most famous, I guess, early modern philosophers, proposed the theory of ownership which derives from the fact of like, how do I get from just being plain old me, like a naked Homo sapiens, to owning this book, right? Or more importantly, for owning land, right? Because at this point, property is still primarily land, right? The thing that Locke thought was that the reason why we can own things is because everybody owns themselves, right? That's the first kind of premise or axiom of this way of thinking. And that as a result, everybody owns their labor, right? Now, this is what is sometimes gets called the mixing theory of property. Because the question then is, well, how does our labor bring about our ownership of things? It brings about our ownership of things because, for instance, if I mix my labor with, for instance, the land, then I own the land insofar as I've labored on it, right? So for instance, Eric the Red lands on Iceland. Eric the Red was a Viking, who lands in Iceland and then finds, a fertile field. And again, at this point, we assume nobody lives in Iceland. It's like Iceland. And he tills the soil and plants some potatoes, right? And then, so the potatoes grow, there's potatoes. Does he own the potatoes? Does Eric the Red own the potatoes that he planted in the earth and grew out of the earth? What do y'all think? Just intuitively.
Yeah.
If you grew some potatoes, would they be yours? Why would they be yours? Because you planted them, you did something. And so this does get kind of tenuous, because the question then becomes something like, well, but still you planted the potatoes, but why would that mean you own the land, right? Well, so the story goes, that's a good point, but it's only because it continues to be yours if you keep laboring it, right? And so, of course, Locke had certain provisos which made sense to him and no longer make much sense to anybody. For instance, he's like, well, this all works and applies, but you have to leave as much for others, right? You can't just, necessarily plant a flag in a whole country and be like, mine. But in so much as you are laboring on the land and actually doing something with it, then it becomes yours through your mixing or mingling your labor with it, right? Does anyone find this plausible, like convincing, like, yeah, sure, that's how it works? I mean, this is a pretty standard way that a lot of people think, right? Because of, we've bought into Locke's story. But Arendt's point is that this is kind of interesting and weird, because the thing that it starts out with is the idea that, first of all, everybody owns themselves, which is, kind of strange. What does it really mean to say that you own yourself? To some extent, that you have the prerogative to do what you want with yourself, but then again, why should that be ownership, right? Most animals have something like that kind of, not literal autonomy, but that prerogative. Like, it seems to come down to just a sort of way of looking at what it is to be able to work, right? One of the ways in which this is different from, say, the medieval period in Europe, Locke was English, but in the medieval period in Europe and England, there was the common belief was something like this: nobody can actually own the earth or the land or things like that. Obviously, the land and all of the things and all of creation belong to God. And God, for some reason, really likes the king, and so again gave him the divine right to rule all this for him. And the king, so it's in temporal or spatial temporal terms, the king owns all the land. And all of the different families or people or nobles and stuff, they just work it because that's their role in this kind of world or society. And they work it and they take care of it on behalf of the king, who holds it on behalf of God. And this whole project is called stewardship, right? That, of course, is a way of thinking about it. This one is like, well, actually, no, we can own things because it starts with us owning ourselves, right? Which is another big different thing, which is not at all like obvious, right? Like even if you look at existing, not even necessarily strongly religious cultures, right? Like due to like the influence of Confucianism, there's still a widely held kind of practice within Chinese society that your parents own your body because they're the ones who gave it to you. And so you can't even get a haircut without their permission, right? Just saying that there are different ways of looking at ownership. This one might seem the most obvious to us, but it's not exactly not odd. It's still like.
How would his theory work? Like, if you're like a lord or something like that, and then you had land, but you hired people to work on that land, do you own the land still, or do you own the people who own the land?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure how at that point, I mean, that's a relatively simple example, but even that I think gets a little too complicated for this. But it's a really good question, right? And the fact that we can raise that question also makes us wonder, is it really plausible that the plantation is yours if all the slaves are working it? And this, of course, mind you, is the classical Marxist point, right? From the perspective of classical Marxism, we'll talk about the similarities really quickly, but the classical problem with Marxism, or the problem that Marxism brings to the fore, is that this is where the slogans come from, like, for instance, profit is theft, right? Because if you really look at who's doing the work, or in this case, more properly speaking, the labor, then if it's true that it's the labor that justifies the ownership, then everybody should be owners insofar as they're laborers, right? And that's why we talk about the phenomenon of, expropriation, right? Which another word for this is nationalization, right? We don't want private owners to be in charge of everything. We want all of the property to become common property in the sense of becoming state property. And then we all just get a share, basically, of the state property. This is what Vey talks about a lot, or what she alludes to in The Need for Roots. And it comes up to a certain extent in Arendt as well. But all of that was to say, we were just talking about this transition of, what you should notice is that on one hand, both Locke, who might represent fairly standard or conservative approach to the property ideas about property, and Marx, who is supposedly the more left-wing or progressive one, both still assume that the primary source of our value comes from our labor. So that again, whether or not you identify as strongly economically on the right or on the left, the irony is that both traditions take something important for granted, which would have seemed weird in ancient times, precisely because labor used to be a thing which was just relegated to the private and not of public concern. And now, like I've mentioned before, we live in a system or a paradigm in which, although we don't have, I mean, there's still common or public property, but we think of it a little bit differently. The point is that it's still the case that most of us still think about our lives and our work and our jobs in terms of our labor power and survival, right? Meeting our needs. So about 4 minutes. Well, okay, so we can probably pull that with this, right? If it's true that consumption is linked to the life process, right, for metabolism. It also means, however, that remember that I guess, hopefully this makes sense, right? And if we think of life as these recurring cycles of decay and birth and death and all of that, then what our mortality consisted in, and what our hence immortality consisted in, was being able to cut through the layers by enduring, right? And so whether this is your individual life, right, represented, or whether it is the duration of a specific object, then either way, right. I'll say individual personal life, because we're not just talking about you as a living organism, we're talking about you as a person who has an identity that can stay the same over time, right? So in that sense, we're mirrored, because the quest for immortality is the quest for relatively longer duration within the ephemeral cycles of nature. But again, so this duration thing is going to correspond to work. And the thing that work was supposed to produce was the common world. Because work is the condition of worldliness, right? So this is how work is supposed to work, right? By physically enduring, physically enduring, which means to weather the cycles of life as long as you can. What Locke and Marx and other people do, though, is that it's as though this, you can also think about it like this, right? This is also, in a sense, property, right? It's one of the things which, through work and by sheltering our individual lives, helps us endure longer, right? But if you confuse property with wealth, wealth acquisition is one of the cycles, right? So it's as though, rather than getting to escape the cycle, if you confuse property with wealth, and then you make your sole objective as a laborer the acquisition of wealth, this is what happens. It gets roped back into the cycle. And then you don't escape it. You just make money for some reason until you die. And then there's nothing durable left because you were too busy on the hamster wheel of economics. Does that make sense? Okay. See you Monday.